So welcome to section 1, Introduction to Data Loss Prevention. On this section, our initial video is about the key elements of data loss prevention and data recovery. So we'll start some statistics. Why data loss prevention is important? So why it matters? What is important in the first place? So let's take a look at some important numbers. So 40 to 60% of a small business won't reopen as a result of a data loss impact. How much does it cost? So we have an average cost of downtime per companies of all sizes around $4,500 per minute. That's actually how much this kind of event will cost us. Additionally, this is also challenging. So every year, definitely data is growing. So difficult definitely to keep track and to be protected against data loss. So those are kind of the common challenges. First, we have a continuously evolving landscape. So data just keeps growing every day. We have an important metric here that around 2025 we'll have like around 175 zettabytes of data worldwide. To give you an idea, the amount of data we're talking about here, 1 zettabyte, is an equivalent of 1,000,000 petabytes. That is a unit used nowadays commonly to measure the volume of data. Additionally, not just data keeps growing every day. Secondly, also, regulatory bodies and compliance requirements just keeps evolving also. We have around like 70 different regulatory bodies worldwide that are commonly used, and those 70 different regulatory bodies will introduce around 15 updates every day. So that just keeps changing. Additionally, we have some important statistics around the basically percentages of compromised data. And we have 52% of compromised data is a result of hacking activities. And 69% of attacks are performed by outsiders. So usually we'll consider a lot inside risk and inside attackers. So yeah. But as you can see, that's a small percentage. So more than half of attacks are still performed by outside attackers. So we definitely need to have a plan in place. And in terms of the total cost of a data breach, we have an interesting number. Like in 2020, the average of a data breach impact was around 3.86 million. So that's how much this is going to cost us. So in some cases, when you have that conversation with an organization, they say, you know what, this is too expensive. So maybe we need to have some specific tools, or we need to invest into a plan to evaluate the risk and how we'll react to a data breach or data loss, how we'll definitely prevent and mitigate that risk. In some cases, maybe you think that this is too expensive. Just pause for a second and see actually how much this is going to cost you if actually you are affected by one of those events at some point of time. So let's explore the common sources of data loss. So we found like 7 different sources of data loss. The first one is due to human error. So in some cases, accidentally, someone can definitely just delete those important files. That could happen. So permanently deleted by that mistake. So how are we going to recover that? Second common source of data loss is related to software issues. So definitely some software maybe is not behaving properly, is not doing what it's supposed to do, and can actually delete some important files. So imagine what will happen if this is a database, and on that database, some of those important transactions actually is deleted and is lost. That could happen. And also, once I experience something around, for example, popular nowadays use virtual machines. What about actually if that virtualization platform actually wipes the BHD of a virtual machine? That could happen. Third, we have hardware issues. So what happens if there's actually a hardware issue, a problem that basically that data stored inside that hardware is affected and we lost those files? That can happen. That's actually what is important. Also think about redundancy and resiliency on every solution that we are designing. I actually have the opportunity to once actually experience that from firsthand. Actually was a university that they experienced like a major power outage, and as cause of that power outage, basically their solution basically was affected, all the storage. So basically all the files were corrupted because of a hardware failure. They tried to definitely recover those, but even the storage actually that hold all the backup files was affected as well. So definitely they have to engage, in this case, the provider directly that basically build that storage solution to try to recover those files first, at least over the backup, so they can definitely just be back up and running. So definitely difficult position to be. That can happen. Another very common source of data loss is also due to data corruption. So maybe just the data gets corrupted, and maybe internally how the file system handles those files not properly, and maybe that information is lost. That could happen also some point of time. The other common source is disaster just happens. As you just described, maybe have a power outage or maybe just a natural disaster, and as a cause of that specific event, data is lost. 6, we have also malware. So malware in some cases definitely have multiple purposes or goals. One of those could be just maybe get control of that data. Some cases we've seen those malwares that maybe just hide those files or those folders. Some cases maybe actually rename your files and just put some different symbols on the file names, just difficult to identify which file is actually the right one. And popular actually nowadays, we have those ransomware attacks that actually encrypt the files, make them unreadable and accessible, and basically they ask for some money. Once you pay, basically they offer you to actually provide you with that key required to decrypt the files and access to the content. That could happen. And lastly, we also have failed upgrades as per of the operating system. So let's say we're doing an operating system upgrade, we're from, let's say, Windows 7 to Windows 10 or from Windows 10 to Windows 11. So definitely as part of that process, something can go wrong and maybe these files are corrupted. So as part of definitely that process to upgrade the operating system in place, typically is always a good idea to do first a backup. Just definitely have a copy of those files. If something goes wrong, we should be definitely just to restore those important files. So those are the common sources of data loss. With that said, let's take a look of important principles of data recovery. So data recovery explained. So first of all, within your computer, whether users or programs basically will be the ones that will be creating those files. Where those files are stored, those basically files are handled by an operating system behind the scenes. So that operating system basically stores the files, and behind the scenes use something known as a file system. So we have different file systems. We have NTFS, we have FAT, we have different file systems that basically, depending on that file system, it will change the model that behind the scenes those files stored basically in blocks of bytes, basically how that information is stored behind the scenes, and will determine also how those permissions are handled, and basically identify which accounts or services are basically authorized to access which portions of that data, or which portions of definitely maybe folders that have on that disk. So definitely that's how that access is controlled behind the scenes. And of course, basically we have all those files that need to be protected, and we have out of the box the operating system will provide with some embedded recovery options. We'll definitely explore those for Windows operating systems. So we have some embedded options there, but always you also have third parties that you can look up to basically have a copy of that file. So definitely ultimately that data recovery will be performed by some sort of tool, either embedded on the operating system of a third party, but ultimately we have like a copy of those files somewhere. So typically what happens, where we store those copies, on the same server or on the same disk, that's never a good idea. Remember, one of the common sources is hardware failure. So what happens if you have just that backup right next to the same original file and something happens to the hardware or the disk, so the backup is gone as well. So never a good idea. So that's actually what in real life best practice is actually to have that copy, that backup in a different place, even physically, or at least in a different disk that is completely independent. So definitely, ultimately, we have that backup that will have that copy of the file. So any point of time you need to restore the files, no problem, you can just grab that copy coming from the backup. So that's typically when we're doing the standard data recovery, just have a backup first, and then we'll do a restore of those files if needed. So how business continuity, disaster recovery, and regulatory compliance risks are related in this case? So closely related in this case to the topic of data loss prevention. So ultimately, that data is your most important asset. So we have different frameworks. At Microsoft, maybe you heard, we have something known as defense in depth. And basically, this is all about having like multiple layers of protection. And on the inner layer, you have your most important asset. What is that? Your data. On top of that, you have multiple layers like network, identity, perimeter, even physical controls. And in each one of those different layers, you have different mechanisms to protect basically all those levels. So what will happen if an attacker would like to take control of your data? They will need to basically pass all those different levels and definitely pass all those different mechanisms at each level. So that will be more difficult for them to get access to that inner layer where your data resides. So that data ultimately is the asset that needs to be protected. So definitely in terms of business continuity, disaster recovery, we should have identified those services, those applications, and most importantly, portions of the data that are critical to ensure the continuity of your organization. So definitely that data, the ones identified, needs to definitely be preserved or replicated somewhere. As I said, definitely some best practices, maybe to a different physical location, a secondary data center, using different media, maybe using tapes, using different disks. So in case maybe you can actually use the cloud nowadays. And basically we'll have a copy of your records into that specific repository. So definitely is a key element of that BCDR strategy, have that data replicated somewhere else. So the risk is definitely there. One of the important is data loss. So ultimately what happens if that data is lost? We cannot ensure continuity of the business. So definitely identify those critical assets. So identify those risks, the effects, and most importantly, the measures, how we mitigate and handle that risk. Third, importantly, we have in some cases maybe business that operate in regulated industries, so they are subject to specific requirements. So maybe on the financial domain, so I may be affected by something like Sarbanes-Oxley, so I need to actually preserve some critical assets for, let's say, the last 5 or 7 years. So you definitely just need to ensure not just continuity, but also make sure that you have a copy, basically, of those records preserved for a specific amount of time. Additionally, what happens in case of data loss? So part of that strategy is that to have that plan in place. So you need to know how to react. If that happens, you need to know, for example, if there's a data breach or data exfiltration that basically took place in your organization, how you will react to that. So in some cases, also you operate in a regulated industry, you actually need to notify the authorities and maybe have a specific timeline for that. So maybe there's a specific process that you should follow. So you definitely need to know how to react to those events. And lastly, definitely we'll explore something that is defined as the cyber kill chain. Definitely cybersecurity is kind of the set of typical steps and the processes or stages that attackers will follow. And ultimately, as part of that cyber kill chain, the last step is basically data exfiltration. So definitely, ultimately, get access to your most important asset, your data, and basically exfiltrate those records. So motivations to do that definitely will be explored in one of the upcoming sections. So let's do a quick summary of what we just covered on this first video. So first, we talk about the importance of data loss prevention. So we talk about some statistics just to highlight the importance of this. Secondly, we uncover the principles of data recovery. And lastly, we also explain the relationship of business continuity, disaster recovery, regulatory compliance risk, and in this case precisely, data loss prevention. On our next video, we have using tools for data backup recovery operations.